welcome everybody to today's webinar about the status of the Housing Trust Fund. I'm going to get us started here in a second and turn it over to our Executive Director in just a second. But I want to get us started here really quickly. Hold on. Just trying to make sure everything works well. All right. So a couple tech issues before we really get into the meat of today's webinar. The first thing, as you figured out, you all are muted, and that's simply due to the volume of participants expected in the webinar. So if you have a question or a concern, or if you're having any issues with the audio or other tech features associated with this webinar, please use that chat or questions feature in your GoToWebinar control panel to communicate with us. We are going to save all questions until the end of the webinar, and that's just simply so that we're not constantly toggling between the control panel and the presentation. But we will do our best to get to every question either at the end of the webinar, or if we need to respond privately afterward, we will do that. Additionally, we are trying to record this webinar, and if we are able to do so successfully, we will try to post a link to the webinar on Cohio's website on the advocacy page after the webinar. Similarly, we are going to post the PowerPoint presentation on the website after the webinar as well, and at the end of this presentation today, I'll show you exactly where you should be able to find all these items on the advocacy page on Cohio's website. Since I'm not seeing anybody shooting me any questions or notes related to quality of audio, I'm going to assume that everyone can hear okay and everyone can see okay. And with that, quick double check. All right, I'm going to get the PowerPoint started, and I will turn it over to Bill.
Good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate you taking time out to hear what's going on with the Housing Trust Fund. It's something that we've been focused on really for the last week as we've gotten serious threats to the Housing Trust Fund future from the Ohio Senate. And I'm going to cover territory kind of from the beginning because I want to make sure those of you that weren't aware of what's been happening hear the story so that everybody's on the same page. And as you know, the Housing Trust Fund's been around for a really long time. I've worked at Cohio for many years, and it dates back all the way to a constitutional amendment in 1990. And so for the past 25 years, the Housing Trust Fund's been an effective program helping on homelessness and a range of affordable housing issues all across the state. But this amendment came up on Tuesday of last week, was the first we ever heard about it. This amendment was inserted into the state budget by the Ohio Senate. There was no advance warning, no debate, no discussion. We were given an opportunity to provide one witness in a hearing that had probably 90 witnesses talking about every issue under the sun in the state budget. So this is being jammed in and pushed through without any real fair process. And this is a significant change. We know that the county recorders have been, who collect the Housing Trust Fund fee, have been after the Housing Trust Fund fee to fund their own operations. So that's part of what's behind where this came from. But this is a big deal. It's a dramatic change, and it's just not being debated in any kind of open manner. So going forward, if this amendment were to pass, a lot of people have asked us, well, what would the impact of this be? Well, if we don't stop this, and there's still a couple opportunities we'll talk about a little later to stop this, but this change would take effect July 1st. So this July 1st. in a couple weeks. From that time on, all the revenues that are collected from the Housing Trust Fund fee through the county recorder's office, half the money would still go to the State Housing Trust Fund, but the other half would be distributed back to the counties based on their Housing Trust Fund fee revenue. So the way the trust fund has been distributed over the past 25 years goes out the window. So you could make really no assumptions of what the state Department of Development or Development Services Agency would do with the money, because all bets are off. A lot of things that have been funded in the past would simply not be funded in the future. But it's reasonable to expect that 50% of all programs would have 50% less revenue to work with. So if your agency receives a grant from the trust fund today, a reasonable expectation is you'd only be able to get half of that amount, because the state will only have half the amount available. So, and any grant awards you think you're going to get beginning in the next fiscal year at the state level, that begins July 1st, that's going to definitely be delayed. It could be months and months before the state figures out how to adjust and what can happen. We're only starting to look at impacts on the state trust fund. I know Erica was spending some time in the last couple of days just looking at the effects on the balance of state. I don't know if you wanted to elaborate and share a couple of points about that.
Sure. So for the balance of state continuum of care, my concerns are really centered around, well, two or three key items. So first, the State Housing Trust Fund has provided a tremendous amount of the match that's needed for us to access federal COC program resources. And the 80 counties in the balance of state in the last fiscal year, we received over $14 million through the COC program. And we're required to match at 25%. That's the minimum federal requirement. But in order for our COC application to score well every year, we need to be matching at 150%. So it's a really huge and significant resource. Loss of that resource absolutely could directly impact our ability to continue to access those funds. Similarly, still connected to the COC program, COCs and their consolidated applications will do well and score well in the annual COC competition each year if they can demonstrate that they are doing work that aligns with various federal policy priorities and that's meeting continuum of care program requirements. And if you can demonstrate you're doing those things, you'll receive, a lot of points for your application. And if you receive a lot of points for your application, then HUD will ensure you continue to have access to renewal funding for projects and will give you access to funding for new projects. And again, for the balance of state, we're talking about $14 million annually, which is the vast majority of homeless resources in our continuum. I was looking at it really quickly today, and I would say 3/4 of the points that HUD awards through the COC competition on those applications are associated with things that would be directly impacted by a loss of housing trust fund resources for the balance of state. So for example, HUD awards a lot of points for COCs that can demonstrate they're implementing coordinated entry and coordinated assessment processes, and that are coordinating homeless services and housing resources for homeless persons across the full continuum. In the balance of state, we've been able to do that largely through our partnership with ODSA, who has required state-funded grantees to participate in coordinated assessment and entry processes and to participate in planning and coordination of services and housing at the local and COC level. If we lose that requirement at the state level, then I have no leverage over those locally funded grantees to continue to participate in that fashion. And if I can no longer demonstrate that we are meeting that federal priority and that program requirement, then that potentially, that in particular really jeopardizes our renewal funding and access to new funding, because I can no longer demonstrate we're meeting basic requirements and meeting federal priorities, and then all of those points associated with items are definitely in jeopardy. So I would say that's probably the most significant thing I'm concerned about. And then of course we have a whole host of small shelters in the balance of state that are serving multiple counties and serve people from areas surrounding their particular county. And I know you'll talk about this more specifically, so I won't go into it much, but I'm concerned about their ability to, those shelters specifically, about their ability to continue to access ongoing funding.
All right, that's good. And we wanted to just speculate a little bit about, so half the money would continue to come to the State Housing Trust Fund, so everybody would expect less money. But then the other half of the money is returned to the counties based on how much Housing Trust Fund fee their county collects. So Nate Kaufman from the Ohio CDC Association is here with us. They have partners all over the state that work on utilizing Housing Trust Fund funds. He's going to talk a little bit about what this local process may look like.
Thank you, Bill, and want to thank all of you on the webinar and most importantly for your advocacy in this most critical issue. The language that was inserted last Tuesday amounts to literally only a few sentences, and want to give an interpretation as to what we see will be the local impact. It states that local HTF panels would be established, we believe comprised of a county commissioner, auditor, and recorder, but that language is not completely firm as there is little substance in these few sentences. So it is completely unknown how the funds at the local level will be distributed and also how effectively. And this is not to be critical of local officials, but the majority of these local officials have little to no affordable housing and homelessness experience. There is not any framework in place to distribute the funds, and I think one could easily state that the Senate passed language is half-baked at best and offers, as I mentioned, little to no substance. Additionally, the Senate amendment has no limit on administrative fees. And this is very important to remember that from day one, going back to 2011, the county recorder's goal has been to capture OHTF funds for their own operations and administrative fees and to siphon that away from the critical use for affordable housing. This, in the short and long term, could amount to nothing more than a cash grab. Additionally, there's not any arbitration process if local officials disagree on how money should be spent. As many of the affordable housing professionals on the phone now, the current trust fund has state formulas and statutory protections relating to protections for allocations to CDCs, to senior projects, to specifically 50% to go to rural communities. The language in the Senate amendment offers no such assurances and gives no protection for those set-asides. Additionally, there is not any protections on income eligibility, only preferences that have no weight whatsoever. It is up to the discretion of county by county. Who knows how that will turn out? As we've seen with many successful OHTF projects, especially in rural areas, are multi-county projects leveraging these funds. Those projects will now need to approach multi-county local boards for funding, and that makes the system, to say the least, unworkable. As Erica mentioned, right now, the Ohio Housing Trust Fund works. It leverages a great deal of funds from other public sources, from other state agencies, and from other private sources. We will lose that through this if this amendment passes. There is not any monitoring or oversight or compliance, accountability, none to speak of within this amendment. So in conclusion, I would just say that the bottom line is that the current system works, it's efficient, it's effective at meeting the needs of vulnerable populations in Ohio. In this new system, all that it does is create all sorts of unknowns, inefficiencies, and massive threats to the delivery of affordable housing and services for Ohio's most vulnerable. So thank you once again for your advocacy. The next 2 weeks, or excuse me, less than 2 weeks, will be critical. I'm going to pass it over to Bill.
Okay, so people should get ready with their questions. If you have any questions or comments, to send those in through the webinar, and we'll get to those in a second. But I wanted just to spend time of where we are in the process and what's yet to happen, and how we could impact it, most importantly. So the Senate budget process is concluding as we speak. Today, the Finance Committee will vote the budget out of the committee, and then the budget will go to the Senate floor either later today or tomorrow. The Senate is expected to pass that bill with few amendments because they're under the gun. Remember, the state has to have a state budget in place for the beginning of the fiscal year, which starts July 1st, like less than 2 weeks away. So that the Senate budget process is coming to a conclusion. The next step in the process would be for the Senate to go to the House within a conference committee. So there'll be 3 representatives of the Senate and 3 representatives of the House that sit on a conference committee to work out the differences in the bill. So we want to make sure we do everything possible to influence those conferees. After they're done with their work, the issue goes to the governor for his signature. Normally, they would give the governor a few days to review the bill and decide if there are things that he's going to line item veto. He can delete things that were added by the legislature in the budget document. So the issue we're talking about now could be vetoed by the governor. That's very important to understand. And you may think, yeah, right. Well, how are we going to get the governor who's like out running for president, to pay attention to this issue when there's so many other issues? Well, the fact of the matter is, Governor Kasich has done it before. Governor Kasich, 4 years ago, the Senate tried to take $15 million a year from the Housing Trust Fund. And he didn't have to veto it, but he did go to the Senate and basically demand that amendment be taken out. He took it up personally. We worked with his people to get the governor talking points on what the background, the history of the trust fund and so forth. And he went to bat for it, and it was really because of his intervention that the trust fund was saved then. And it could be because of his intervention that the trust fund is saved now. So on the conference committee, the next thing you could do is really any House member, and so you got to remember the House membership may have very little knowledge that this amendment is even happening because it didn't happen in the House. The trust fund went through the House without any controversy, and everything was fine. So we got to educate our House members. Particularly the Republicans because they're in the majority, but any of the House members to communicate with their conferees about the importance of the housing, to strip out the Senate language that was added on the Housing Trust Fund. And the simple message is we want to support the House version when it comes to the Housing Trust Fund. That's what we want. Now, it should be easy for them because that's their version. But we have to communicate with them. So you may ask, well, who are these conferees going to be? Who are the 3 people from the House and who are the 3 people from the Senate? They've not been officially announced. We will have them on our website once they are announced for sure. They'll be on the advocacy page. But we expect them to be Representative Ryan Smith, who's the finance chairman in the Senate. And I'll just tell you, he has a history of strong support, or in the House. I'm sorry, did I say the Senate? Representative Ryan Smith, he's House Finance Chairman, a big supporter of the trust fund, has helped us in a number of ways since he's been in the legislature. I know he doesn't like this Senate amendment, so he's predisposed to help us. But, hearing from people in his district and other parts of the state doesn't hurt. The other member will be, we think, Representative Kirk Schuring, who's from the Canton area, and he has been sympathetic in the past. We hope he remains that way in the future. Reaching out to Representative Schuring is important as well. The Democrat member from the House will be Representative Denise Treehouse. She's from Cincinnati. I talked with her on the phone a couple times, most recently yesterday. She is totally supportive of our position and will do everything she can do. The problem with is that the Democrats they don't have much leverage. The Senate members will likely be Senator Olslager, who's the finance chairman in the Senate. And while he has been supportive in the past, because the Senate inserted this amendment, we're not clear what he will do in conference committee. He could simply represent the Republican caucus in the Senate and not vote to remove it, or to he'll argue to keep the language that the Senate put in. So we need to lean on Senator Olslager to protect the Housing Trust Fund. The other Republican senator is likely to be Senator Bill Coley. He's also from the Cincinnati area. Bill Coley is the author of the amendment that takes half the money and sends it to the local area. So he is not on our side. We've met with them. We've talked with them. We've tried to get him to back off. We've had other people have met with him and talked with him. And I think I think I would put him in the lost cause column. He's going to be a no vote for us, and there's not a lot we could do. The Democratic member will be Senator Mike Skindell. He's from the Cleveland area and is very supportive, as are other people in his caucus. So the key is getting to your House members, getting to the members who are likely to be on the conference committee. They'll be listed on the advocacy page of the Coioa website. If you have any questions about, who the people are or how to find out who your members are, if there's any questions about that, Kathy Johnston, who's here with us, our advocacy director, is just email Kathy. She could run down all that information for you and get it to you right away. So her email is right there on the slide. One last thing, and then we want to open it up for questions. There's a press release, which Erica will show you in a second, that we sent out yesterday as soon as we saw what the final result of the Senate process was going to be. And I would encourage you to take that release, adapt it for your own use, and send it out to your local media. We did get a couple little mentions when we sent it out in some of the press, but the problem is the State House press corps is not what it used to be, and there's not a lot of reporters in it, and they have about 10,000 issues right now to cover. But your local media may pick it up from the angle of local groups in your area are concerned about what's happening to the Housing Trust Fund. And I can't emphasize this point enough. The more this becomes an issue in the public domain, in the press, people are talking about it, the more we'll get the attention of the conference committee, the more we'll get the attention of the governor. They're going to try to deal with the squeaky wheel issues. There's a ton of issues in the budget. So this getting the local press with local people quoted, don't worry about quoting us, quote local people about what the impacts could be, and get it to local media outlets, newspapers, radio, TV, whatever you could do. We want to encourage you to do that. And our best bet ultimately, as the slide shows, is the big veto. If all else fails, the governor does have the opportunity to stand up. And you got to remember, you may not just agree with everything that this governor does, but he has gone to bat multiple times around homeless issues, around issues regarding people with mental health and recovery issues. He has done a number of things. He did Medicaid expansion. He's gone to bat for people that are vulnerable, and he's gone to bat in the past on the Housing Trust Fund. So we got to communicate with him. So anybody people on your board, people with connections in the business community, people that maybe active in Republican politics. Anybody that would have a connection to the governor or friends of the governor or staff of the governors, use them and just communicate through your channels to the governor and the governor's office that if this thing arrives on his desk, he should veto the Senate language on the Housing Trust Fund. We're working the angles that we have access to, and I know that Department of Development or Development Services, the Mental Health and Addiction Services Agency, I know the people at OFA and really the Office of Health Transformation. We're talking to all of them to make sure that they communicate to the governor's budget folks to veto this language if it makes it to his desk. You know, I do think this is a feasible strategy, but we want to do everything possible to stop it before it gets there. You know, I have communicated with the budget director, Tim Keene. He's very much aware of what this Senate language does, and I know he's been a supporter of the trust fund in the past. So we got to just keep up the good work, and maybe it would be good to take some questions. If any of you have questions, if you haven't sent them in, you could send them in through the portal.
Great. Before I get to questions here, and what I'll do is I'll go ahead and go through the list and I'll just kind of read them out loud and allow Bill or Nate to respond how they, as is most appropriate. But before I dive into that, I'm pulling up Cohio's website here because I want to show you all where the advocacy page is, and you can see where where the press release and other materials are that we've referenced so far today. So here's Cohio's website, simply cohio.org. If you want to access the advocacy page that's talking particularly about the work around the Housing Trust Fund, you can go to the advocacy icon there and then state issues. And then you'll see all of the information that we've been talking about. A lot of information, the press release that they has been talking about, they've spoken about, as well as some fact sheets. So that is where you can find those, and I'll leave that up. And with that, I'll go ahead and get to some of these questions. So first question, someone was asking what the term COC meant. I can answer that. Sorry, that refers to Continuum of Care. The Continuum of Care program is the federal program that provides funding for homeless assistance programs across the nation. In the state of Ohio, that brings in about $96 million annually from the federal government. And again, for the 80 counties in the Ohio Balance of State Continuum, that brings in closer to 15. Okay, so we have someone who's asking for a variety of different types of outcomes data related to number of homeless people served by county, units of affordable housing available in those places, things like that that are supported by the Housing Trust Fund. If that's kind of, maybe that's something we can address offline.
Well, if you want to find out about what the Housing Trust Fund has done historically, if you just Google Ohio Housing Trust Fund, you'll go to the website that's on the Development Services Agency, and if you click on the annual reports that are filed, you could see some outcome data on those annual reports, as well as a county by county breakdown of who received the funding that year. So again, that's just Ohio Housing Trust Fund section of the Development Services website.
Great. We have someone who's asking if the governor seems to be favoring this amendment.
We don't have any indication that the governor is favoring the amendment, but he's been kind of busy doing a lot of traveling, so we haven't heard him speak to the amendment one way or another. I know that a number of people that work in the governor's administration are expressing a lot of concern about the amendment. They don't like the amendment, but that doesn't necessarily make it all the way up the food chain. That's why we have to get other people to communicate our concern.
Great. We have a question here about who authored the amendment. This question came in early, so it was probably before you got to it, but would you mind letting them know one more time?
Well, Senator Bill Coley from Cincinnati probably put the actual amendment. Oh, Butler County. Well, Cincinnati area. Sorry, Southwest Ohio, Butler County. He told us that he put the amendment in, but we have to. He did have the backing of the Senate leaders to put it in, and they have referenced. That they were lobbied by certain local officials. That would be the County Recorders Association to send the money back, most of the money back to the county. So it was really a layered motivation to put this amendment in and provide the rationale for it. I mean, it doesn't. They're not real big on rationale. There's not a lot of rationale for it, but that's what we know. Senator Coley put it in, but it was with the backing of the Senate leadership.
All right, another question. This is sort of about process. One of the attendees has said they thought that there were senators who were going to change the language, and they're wondering if we have any updates on what happened there, anything additional that you're hearing from some of the state senators?
Well, we do know a number of senators submitted an amendment to take this language out of the bill. I mean, Senator Bacon and Senator Lehner and Dayton and others that we actually got confirmation that they did that. The problem is that is a behind the scenes process where those amendments go into the leadership and they look at them and decide which ones they're going to act favorably on. So that's behind closed doors. We don't really know. It's not an open process. I mean, the Senate leadership sits around, which they did last weekend and last Friday, and sorts through all the amendments that came in and decide which ones they're going to take up. So the members on both sides of the aisle, the entire Democratic caucus, which is 10 senators, as well as maybe as many as 5 or 6 Republicans submitted amendments to have this removed, and it was not removed. That's what we know. What happened behind the scenes is hard to tell. Obviously, it wasn't in our favor.
So a couple of people have asked if there's any possibility that anything will change today before they pass the budget.
No. I hope maybe intervention from God. That's about. We're down to saying the rosary. Because I'm not sure what else. We do know that Senator Tavares, who's a Democrat from the Columbus area, submitted an amendment. It's kind of a Hail Mary amendment to have the language removed. But given that she's a Democrat and in the deep minority, that amendment will be what they call laid on the table, which means not acted on. And so, I mean, there's efforts by some to try to get it changed, but it's just not going to happen.
All right. We have another question, another person asking for information about emergency shelters in their area that are funded through the Housing Trust Fund, but I think you already addressed this earlier in terms of talking about where they can access that awards information. We have a specific question about the kind of language they need to use when advocating with their representative and their state senator. She's asking, should they ask them to remove the Senate amendment, or do they need to ask them to replace it with replace the language or change the language? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, that part is actually quite simple. It's simply to remove the language that the Senate added. Another way to say it is to accept the House version of the housing trust fund portion of the budget bill. So the simple way to say it is we like the House version, not the Senate version. So there's no need to add anything. It's just to take out what the Senate did.
Great. We have an interesting question about, what we might know about what County Commissioners Association or the County Auditors Associations are doing in relationship to this amendment, if anything. She's wondering where they may fall on this particular issue, if you know?
The County Commissioners Association has taken a position of neutrality. One of their lobbyists told me the other day that when somebody's handing you money, it's hard to say no. But on the other hand, they recognize that this may not be the best way to administer trust fund dollars. So different commissioners around the state have different views on it. So they've taken a position of neutrality. They're not advocating for this, but they're not actively advocating against it. The county recorders, we know, were part of the advocacy for this amendment, including the lobbyists that their association hires. So they, you never know about individual recorders, but as a group, they've been a big part of our problem. The county auditors have not weighed in one way or another, to my knowledge. One of the lobbyists said that he thought the governor would probably veto the thing, but we can't take that for granted.
Right. And we had a couple people who've asked about the potential impact of this amendment on current awards through the Housing Trust Fund. So there are, particularly for the homeless programs, I know that they get funding now that spans a 2-year window. So there are a half of the current homeless program grantees were awarded funding last year, and their grants are technically in place until the end of 2016. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, if you have a contract in hand and you've already gotten your award, this amendment will not impact that. They could not provide you with a contract until they had the funds available for this. It's any decisions made by the Development Services Agency, the Housing Finance Agency, or any other state agency involved in the distribution of trust fund resources starting July 1st and beyond that you have to worry about. So I know a bunch of the homeless groups are submitting applications for consideration this summer. I think those are due July 1. Those grants requests would be impacted. So it's any decision that Development Services has not yet made is in jeopardy. And I think a safe assumption, a reasonable assumption is everybody will get cut in half because they're going to have half the money. Now the department may decide that they're going to eliminate funding for some groups entirely in order to focus their resources in certain areas. We just don't know. They don't really know yet. There'd have to be months of a process to try to figure out how to adjust to this, and that would cause delays in everyone getting any grant awards, even if it's at a heavily reduced level.
Great.
No, that's not great. But
No, thank you for answering the question. We have a question here. This person's asking if you feel like you have support for our position from House leadership. And then if you can, again, we've had a couple questions asking to talk about the strategy for advocacy with the conference committee again. So if you could just summarize that again, I think that would be helpful.
We don't know about House leadership yet. I mean, we've been focused on trying to get this fixed in the Senate before the bill left there. We know, it's safe to say that one of the leaders in the House is the finance chairman, Ryan Smith. He is a big supporter of the trust fund. He does not like this amendment, and he personally will fight against it. But if you go down the list of people in the Senate leadership, from Rosenberger, the speaker, we just don't know. I mean, he's the Speaker of the House, and if we'll have the Senate leadership team and the House leadership team on the website. We just don't know. I mean, that's why they need to hear from people in their districts about the importance of getting rid of this Senate amendment. But they will work it through those conference members that I mentioned, and it's very important that we communicate our concern to them. So given that this only happened a week ago, we simply don't know where people are going to come down. That's why we are appealing to all of you and to many others to help make this case. We can't do it alone.
And if I can just add, it's a matter of intensity. The budget is hundreds of different items, thousands of pages, and they need to hear in force because they are going to be hearing about every issue under the sun over the next few days. And so the more that we can elevate our voice through you becomes that much more critical.
Great. A couple final questions, and it looks like that may be, we might have gotten to the end of them unless people have additional questions. And if you do and haven't submitted one yet, make sure you do so right away because it looks like we're almost at the end of them. This first question, I mean, I think I can speak to this one a little bit. This attendee is asking if we think that the Emergency Solutions Grant allocation and the Homeless Crisis Response Program funding will be impacted by this potential cut, and particularly for rural communities, the 80 in the Balance of State COC that we just talked about. Sorry about that. I can tell you explicitly for those programs, you will absolutely be impacted, and you will be impacted dramatically. The rural emergency shelters and those receiving funding for homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing work, that funding is almost exclusively funded through the Housing Trust Fund. The Emergency Solutions Grant funds that come to the state and that are then allocated to communities, those go almost exclusively to the urban areas. So rural communities would absolutely be impacted. This ESG would not provide a buffer. So yeah, you should be very worried. And then the last question that I have right now, oh, I just got a couple more. So the another question we just got was, I'll just read it to make sure I get the language right. This person says, OFA just released their low-income housing tax credit awards along with the Housing Trust Fund that will support their development. And she's saying she's assuming that the allocations of the Housing Trust Fund for that development are now probably in jeopardy, and she's wondering if we can speak to that. And I don't know if I can, but
Yeah, the HTAP program at OFA, which they use in conjunction with tax credits as well as other projects, that will be dramatically impacted. I would actually think that the HTAP awards going forward into the future could receive some of the biggest cuts. It's just because of the other issues that the Development Services Agency is juggling that they cut those resources even deeper than some others. But the awards that were just made by OFA, I don't think would be impacted immediately because that's based on earlier allocations from the trust fund. So I'm not for certain, but my guess would be those would not be reduced since they were made on appropriated money from this current fiscal year. It's any decisions made from July 1st of 2015 on that are the ones that will be in major jeopardy.
Another question we have, this person's wondering if there's any kind of sign-in letter that's been circulated around or anything like that.
No, we are, instead of that, because we need people to communicate directly with their House members, their offices, with anybody that you can within the governor's administration, because that personal connection, or if members on your board know some of those people, those personal connections are what are really important. We didn't do and don't expect to do a sign-on letter just because it's not. Those things are not as effective as the personal communication. I don't know, Nate, if you want to.
Personal.
Yeah. Nate likes the personal touch too.
Another question here. I accidentally skipped this one earlier, so I'm going to backtrack. And again, you all addressed this in the PowerPoint, but I thought it might be helpful for people who maybe joined later, just as a refresher. This particular attendee was essentially asking if what we know about how these funds might be distributed and the programs implemented at the county level if the amendment moves forward.
The language does not speak to that. It is silent on county executive models such as in Cuyahoga and Summit, but we figure there'd be some system. It goes back to the fact there are so many unknowns with this, just a few sentences to disrepair and destroy a 25-year-old and successful program.
Yeah, and I have to say the counties have been hard hit. I mean, the local government fund cuts, a number of the other tax changes that were made impacted the counties. I mean, we're sympathetic to the struggles, the financial struggles that they face. But if you're sitting in one of those county offices, your tendency would be to say, well, how could I siphon off some of this money and use it for things, maybe even housing related things that we do now, so that I could free up other dollars and use it for other county administration issues. We know the recorders want to siphon off money out of this for their own internal operations. And as Nate pointed out, the language has no limits on administrative fees. So if they decide to keep 25% of the money for local administration at the county level, there's nothing stopping them from doing that. There's no oversight. They don't have to report what they're doing. Nobody investigates what they're doing. There'll be 88 new county bureaucracies deciding what happens with half the trust fund, and that's the problem.
Now, it looks like that's about all the questions I've received. Although I did, was asked to mention one thing in thinking about, the possible impact of the cut to the Housing Trust Fund and the amount of money that the state would be administering, and thinking about what the possibilities might be for what that looks like for current grantees or potential new grantees. One of the possibilities that I've heard recently it's a possibility. There's so much that's unknown, but it would definitely be a possibility that, at least in terms of the state homeless crisis response program, the supportive housing program, and potentially others who are looking to get access to resources right now, there's the possibility that there would be no awards made at all, that there would be a period of time in which they would have to figure things out entirely and start from scratch. So there's just no way to know at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the trust fund has funded these certain categories of funding for a long time. And that's the same if you look at what OFA has done with their HDAP resources. An example is they provide a lot of subsidy to projects that are developing permanent supportive housing. Well, that requires significant amounts of money, from the trust fund for each one of those projects that get done every year. It may be that a decision gets made, we simply can't do that going forward. We can't take that much money and apply it to a single project. I mean, they may just say, we're going to have to focus our attention on shelters just to keep shelters open, and we're not going to fund other kinds of homelessness intervention. We may say, we simply can't afford, to fund any of the statewide programs like Habitat for Humanity. Right now, a portion of money goes to support Habitat for Humanity projects in urban areas and in some cases rural areas. Well, they may decide that's simply something we can no longer afford to do. They have to operate a program that's 50% smaller than what it is today. So there will be pain and suffering for, grantees. I mean, that includes all of us. I mean, everybody that works in this field is going to see negative impacts. And really, when I've taken a look at, who the beneficiaries are, there are counties with high capacity, meaning they have good groups operating with best practice that are very competitive when they apply for housing trust fund funds. Those kinds of projects are the ones that are likely to suffer the most. You know, like I know that certain urban areas get more money back than they put in. I know that certain rural areas get more money than they put in. Well, that could change tremendously. We have a protection in the state trust fund dollars that half the money has to go to rural parts of the state. Well, we'd only have 50% of the funds, so the rural parts of the state will suffer big time. Some of those rural areas get a very small amount of money raised from the housing trust fund fees in their area. I looked at Adams County the other day. The total amount of fees that they gather is something like $90,000. So their program at the local level would be based on around $45,000. Um, you know, the local impacts could be tremendous, and that's assuming that the local officials decide to do something reasonable with the money, and there's no assurance that that's going to happen.
And it looks like we've maybe got one more question here. And this person's asking if you can explain what the source of the funds are for the Housing Trust Fund, and if you can talk about if any of those funds are staying in the counties currently, or how the money is being distributed.
Right. The current mechanism, about 13 years ago, I think it was, we were able to get a dedicated source of revenue for the Housing Trust Fund. And what it is at the county level, through the county recorder's office, they collect recording fees on documents that are filed with their office. At the same time, they collect a housing trust fund fee on those same documents that are filed with their office. The housing trust fund fee mirrors the county recording fee. It's the same amount. So if they collect $25 on a recording fee, they also collect $25 on a housing trust fund fee. Once that money is accumulated over the course of 3 months, so once a quarter, the counties have to submit that money to the state, to the state treasurer, that's collected from the housing trust fund fee. They are permitted to keep 1% of what they collect in housing trust fund fees. That's at least theoretically, to use for county administration of collecting the housing trust fund fee, and that's been that way the entire time. The 1% is something that is kept by the county and is usually used to support the recorder's offices.
I think that looks like that's about all the questions we have. Would you like to close out?
Well, I appreciate everybody's advocacy so far. I mean, even though we didn't prevail yet, the effort in the Senate was great. Let's do a similar effort in the House and get to those House conferees and get this Senate language out of the bill. Please report back through Kathy as to any of your state representatives that you've heard from. Do they support protecting the Housing Trust Fund or not? If they have questions, you could get us those. We'll get you answers. Anything we could do to be a resource. But we're only going to win this if the constituency for the Housing Trust Fund gets active and like never before in the next week or so, because that's where it'll all come down. And I think we could win. I'm confident that we could get this taken care of, but it's not going to happen by magic or by anything that I do. It's only going to happen by what you do and the advocacy that you come up with. And I would just remind people to think about not just what you could do, but what your friends could do, what your board members can do, who has Republican connections, who have business community connections that would go to bat for this and contact their state legislator. Sometimes those are the best connections that we get. It's not just what you know, It's what your friends know that can help us move this forward. Nate, you want to?
Absolutely. It's all hands on deck, not just the folks on this webinar, but your colleagues. We need all of your help. It's mission critical, and thank you so much for your efforts.
Great, thanks. With that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Please check back on the advocacy page on Cohio's website for the PowerPoint, a link potentially to the recorded webinar, and additional materials as they get released in the coming days. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact any of us here, Bill or Kathy. Thank you very much.